I want you to think of a time that you were lost in a crush. Fantasies of them keep popping in your mind, of things you might do together, things you might say to them, a memory of you all laughing together. And it feels almost incontrollable. Like thoughts of them keep popping up in your head when you're at work, when you're doing chores. And it both feels good, but it also feels a little bit all-consuming. It feels so intense that you almost wish you could turn down the volume on that knob. What I'm describing here is so common that there is a term for it that some of the population experiences. It is called limerence. Maybe you've heard of this term. I think that some people use it correctly. Some people just throw it around to mean the same thing as a crush, which limerence is a bit different than a regular crush. In this episode, we're going to deeply dive into limerence and the idea of getting validation from another person, because I won't bury the lead. A lot of this is what that is about. We are looking for this person to save us from our feelings, from ourselves, from our sense of not feeling good enough potentially. This is part 5 in our series on our relationship with ourselves. So it might seem interesting to have an episode on limerence or on crushes in a series on our relationship with ourselves. But like we're going to get into in this episode, it's often not even about the other person, but a need that we're hoping that they fulfill within us. So we'll cover how to meet those own needs for ourselves and much more in this episode. Welcome to Immersion. I'm your host, Pamela, and here we explore psychology and philosophy topics to find meaning in the modern world. Let's dive in. So first, let's define limerence, and then we'll go into an example from culture, actually from a TV show. So limerence is defined as an involuntary, obsessive form of romantic interest. There is often idealization, for instance, those rose-tinted glasses we see this person through. There are intrusive thoughts. We can't get this person out of our mind. And it feels a little bit more all-consuming than a typical crush. And we need this reciprocation versus just wanting it. So for instance, how happy or how good about yourself on a day-to-day basis might depend on how they act towards you. Did they smile at you? Did they say hi that day in a certain way? And will often feel very uncertain in their presence versus comfortable in their presence. All of these things we're going to double click on and go deeper into later, but I do want to start to help you differentiate because there's a chance you felt a different kind of crush in the past, and there's a chance that you felt limerent. Not every time we like someone would be categorized under limerence. So a great example from modern culture is the show Vladimir, which was a series on Netflix adapted from the book by Julia May Jonas. Now, it's also important to note that limerence is in tons of stories. Romeo and Juliet, West Side Story. It's throughout so many songs that we hear, as we'll talk about later. Our culture is obsessed with limerence. But I think that this show in particular, Vladimir, really portrays what it feels like from a first-person point of view to be limerent. The show is about a tenured professor named M. We actually don't know her full name, which I think is fascinating. In a lot of ways, she doesn't even feel like a fully formed human because her sense of reality gets distorted often. Again, we don't know her full name, and her self-concept is so fragile, which I'm going to touch on in a minute, but let me get through the plot. Essentially, this younger professor moves into town, Vladimir. She's in her upper 50s. He's, I think, around 30, so big age difference. They're both writers and work in the English department. Very into literature. They hit it off right away. But clearly, she gets way too invested in this guy. I mean, wild things, such as when he leaves his swim trunks at her and her husband's house one time, she just keeps them in her purse constantly just to have on her and close to her instead of giving them back. One time when he cancels, she starts cutting things up wildly in the garden that were really important to her husband because she can't tolerate that rejection in the moment. And there are many examples of, like I mentioned, having a fragile sense of self, which is a huge part of this. We first meet when she's getting ready to go to a faculty meeting. And we see her before that at the store collecting ingredients for what she refers to as, I believe, a you salad, which she says that people love. And turns out no one actually touches the salad later. We get a shot of it untouched on the table. I think this points to a few things. One, she's this type of woman that wants to maybe look better than other people, to have this salad with these fancy organic ingredients and to look like, oh, I'm so healthy and put together that I can make this special salad. But then no one actually wants it. And I don't even know what % of her knows that people don't actually want it, but she definitely brought it to look better than other people, which is very much connected to everything we're talking about in this self-esteem series. So right away, we realize that she's not a reliable narrator because, again, people don't actually like the salad that she said they like, but also that she greatly cares about how she stacks up next to others. Look at this thing I brought and how much better I am than you because I brought it, is what she's saying. That's such a tiny thing, but sometimes we can learn a lot about people from a tiny example. Not always. Now, unreliable narrators are pretty common, but this is the most stark example that I've seen in recent memory, where she's having a conversation with his wife, for instance, and the wife says, sometimes I wish he would cheat on me. And I was reading on Reddit and some people were saying, yeah, I don't think the wife actually said that. That's something she imagined. And I was a little bit too trusting going through the series at first. And it was only things that were really obvious that they were not happening that I knew were illusions, such as her having a fantasy of them physically being together. I knew that didn't happen because it would snap back to the real reality there. And if you've ever been Limerent, so many of these things were very textbook. She cared a lot about her appearance. She would go out of her way to try to run into him. She would be a little bit overeager, trying to orchestrate times for them to be together. And he was always a little bit more laid back, less into it. He would express enough interest, I think, to keep hers. I don't know whether that was intentional or not. I think it was. But then never as much interest as her, which brings us to a really key point. In fact, there are two things that keep Limerence going. And these are from a book by Dorothy Tenov, who is the original researcher who coined the term limerence. Those two ingredients are, one is uncertainty and the other is hope. So for instance, if you like someone and you lock eyes across the room and they quickly look away, the uncertainty aspect that you might glean from that is that, oh, they maybe don't like me. They looked away quick. But the hope aspect is, oh, but they looked at me. Maybe they feel the same way I am and they're just nervous like me. So we're constantly analyzing, often overanalyzing, little moments with this person and what they mean. And we will often interpret them in a way that keeps us limerent. So for instance, if the person doesn't even say hi to you that day, you might again assume, oh, they're probably nervous like me and don't feel comfortable saying hi. You might still keep hope despite reality pointing to the fact that you all don't have a very deep, genuine connection the same way two people who would say hi to each other do. But then there's the uncertainty because clearly you're not with them. You haven't had real evidence that they want to be with you. And this can be on a huge spectrum of closeness. Something that really surprised me in the book is that even two people that have been married for decades could still have limerence as part of their relationship if one person does not feel secure in the relationship, like they, I don't want to say have the other person, but like that they're truly wanted by that person, connected to them. There's always a bit of this pursuer and pursued, and the pursuer maybe feels a bit anxious and like they need to do things a certain way and excited when they hear from the other person. And I found this really sad that someone could still feel that way within a marriage. And I do think that these terms can be kind of slippery because the way she described it did sound like this person was still limerent, but the way I'm describing it here almost just sounds like an anxious attachment style, which I do believe that people that are more on the anxious side of anxious attachment could become limerent more often, but also avoidance can as well. That avoidant person might not feel safe or comfortable being in a real secure relationship, so they keep people at arm's length, but then they might idealize or fantasize about an ex or about someone that they can't really be with. And they get this simulation of being in love and the possibility of something coming out of it, but without the uncertainty of being in a real relationship with someone. So something you can pause and ask yourself here, if you're not sure if you're limerent or if you like the person in a more, I guess you could say, genuine way that you're hoping leads to an affectionate bond versus just the chase of trying to get with this person to feel okay about yourself, would be, how would you feel if this person walked up to you tomorrow and said that they wanted to be with you? Because a few things can happen when you have the option of forming a relationship with your limerent object. I'm going to go over in a bit why it is called a limerent object. I know that sounds like a strange way to phrase it if you haven't heard it, but it's important. But first, let's talk about how this could play out. It can lead to love. Two people can be limerent for each other. I know of a couple that's happily married and their relationship started out where they were both limerent for each other. So it can turn into affectionate love later. It could turn into that anxious kind of chasing within a relationship still, because yes, you sort of have that bond, but you're not sure if it's going to last. Or you might realize, I don't actually think we would be good together if it was actually an option. Oh no. And that's something interesting to chew on and journal on, is why are we so obsessive about this person? And maybe we hadn't even thought about if they walked up to you tomorrow and said, hey, I want to be with you. How would that feel? What would that kick up? But the reason why the person you are fantasizing about is called a limerent object, or an LO, is because when we are limerent, we are objectifying. That is really important to note. We are not seeing them as a full person because we are idealizing them, putting them on a pedestal. And if this has ever happened to you, you know that it does not feel good. It is not flattering. Because you know this person isn't really seeing the full me or the real me. And you almost feel, again, like some sort of object that they're trying to pursue. We don't try to do this to people. The impression I get from the book is that part of this is just like a biological process that can happen to people, again, when there's many other psychological processes happening. One step we're going to get into in the action step component, because the last probably quarter of this episode will be on action steps we can take, but it's important to understand what's happening first. But one action step we can take is to see reality clearly. When we are limerent about someone, we often do see their faults. That's something that Dr. Tinov did talk about in the book, is that one misconception is that people that are limerent cannot see the faults of the other person. But actually in her research, she found that if you sat them down and said, can you tell me their flaws? People can describe them, but we diminish them. We say why it doesn't matter to us. We don't think about them. And then we really magnify what we like about them, or even neutral things we start to idealize and see in a positive light. And we really spend most of our time and energy thinking about what we like about them and seeing them in a positive light. The other reason why our relationship with them is not based in reality, I think, is painted by Heidi Priebe very well in one of her episodes on limerence. She has a couple. I'll link one down below for you. And I don't know if it's in this episode, but she does talk about how when we are limerent, we don't actually want to spend a lot of time with this person. In fact, we might feel anxious around them, kind of hoping the situation ends and goes okay, trying to get through it. But then we're looking forward to later replaying those instances in our mind. Again, part of the fantasizing is not just about the future, it's also about the past. Oh, I love the way they kind of smiled and looked away in an embarrassed way, but I think that means they like me too. And that little joke I said landed. Oh, I was nervous to say it and it went well. And all of these things. And you see me kind of lighting up. So what's funny about limerence is, I think as a culture, we sort of love it and we sort of can't stand it. I was talking to one of my very good friends about this episode, and she's been excited for it. She's been talking to me about it in preparation. And when I brought it up, she kind of started twirling her hair and smiling and almost blushing because she was just thinking about how it feels to be limerent. But then what's interesting is sometimes after a limerent episode ends, you finally get over this person into the other side and you just think, oh gosh, that is a form of love addiction and I do not want to experience it again. You might go out of your way to avoid people that you can feel those limerent feelings starting for. Something I also found that's interesting, speaking of the start of limerence, and also speaking of this not being about the person and being more about you and what's going on with you, is that Tenov talked about there being this sort of beginning phase where a person is open to limerence, and they might even almost view people as interchangeable. They might have a few possible LOs. Maybe there's a couple people, one at work and one at the gym and one that they run into often in the neighborhood where they could feel, oh, this person is a possibility. And they might get a little limerent about one and a little limerent about another. And it's almost like this sort of race in their mind that's going on unconsciously. And one of them might reveal themselves to be not that great of a person from a moral integrity standpoint. And then, you drop off them. But then, the other two bachelors are still in your mind. And it's almost like this positive field. And I almost picture these magnets outside of you and different ones are getting pulled in. And whichever one ends up being the LO then gets all of your attention. Once you are fully limerent about someone, one other aspect about it is because it's all consuming, you do want that exclusivity, that monogamy of I want that person, I want them to want me, and I want it to be just us. I'm sure there could be exceptions to that, but she in the book did describe this sort of possessive intensity about it that is different than affectionate or companionate love. And I'd like to make a further distinction here, that it's not just a crush or limerence, but there are actually different types of love and romantic feelings we can have towards someone. There's a really useful framework for this called Sternberg's triangular theory of love. And I remember learning about this in undergrad. I'm going to put the triangle on the screen here if you're watching. And if you are listening, I will have a link for you to see a visual of it in the description. On the different sides of the triangle, we have intimacy or liking at the top, commitment on the bottom right, and passion on the bottom left. And the neat part is on different sides of the triangle, we can see, well, what about if we have different combinations of this? So for instance, if we have intimacy or liking someone and passion, that would be romantic love. And that doesn't always come with a commitment. We can have a very romantic attachment to someone without a commitment to them. If we just have a commitment, that is called empty love. They have that there as well. That is kind of when we get that roommate feeling with a partner, unfortunately, which often comes from just doing logistics, getting groceries, but not having any shared vulnerability or new experiences or growth or other types of connections together anymore. If we like someone and we also have that commitment, but there's no passion anymore, that is companionate love. And there's nothing wrong with a relationship moving more towards this. And there are people, such as Esther Perel, who do go into ways to keep passion in long-term relationships. So I think that there's a lot of gray areas here. But the last one, I don't know, I find this kind of funny, is just passion and just commitment is fatuous love. And the reason why I find that funny is I looked up fatuous and it basically means silly. And it is a little silly to just have a lot of passion and commitment to someone, but not like them, because that is not having the liking at the top. And in the middle of the triangle is consummate love, where you like them, there's intimacy, there's passion, and there's commitment, and it is all of the things. Throughout a lot of the book on limerence, Dr. Tenov does talk about companionate love as a contrast to limerence because it's the kind of thing that is a bit easier to maintain long term, that liking and the commitment, and passion we know comes and goes. I think that this is a neat framework because it shows that there are different ways of looking at this rather than just intensity of the crush as to a measure for limerence. But really, the intensity of infatuation or passion, that bottom left, might be the closest thing to limerence if that's really amplified. that extreme obsessive infatuation without having a commitment. In fact, that's a big part of it that fuels that intense uncertainty, that fuels limerence. And often there isn't much of knowing the other person yet. So that liking and intimacy isn't really built yet. So it's mostly that bottom left part of the triangle. And it's also important to realize that these have different biological processes. I've been learning more and more lately how this novelty phase, limerence crushes, it's really driven by dopamine and a bit also of an adrenaline rush. And I've noticed that when I'm in connections like this that are very dopamine heavy, there will be a bit of a crash, actually, maybe a day or two later. Whereas when we have more of that bonding, companionate love, that is driven by oxytocin, vasopressin, and that is going to form deep attachments. It feels a lot safer, predictable, there's trust, and that does not have a sharp drop off, even though it feels less intense in the beginning. And this was designed so that we could have long-term relationships because it's not very sustainable to have these extreme highs and lows. In fact, in the book, the people that did have limerence through a lot of their life, it really took a toll on them. And if we think about this from an evolutionary perspective, often we have these really intense bonding experiences in the beginning, and that dopamine, that extreme pull towards a person, because it's going to lead to some pair bonding. That couple might have a child or children, and then they move towards that companionate love, which has more sustainable neurochemistry to just sustain a bond, but also get things done. Because as we're finding out, it's very hard to get things done when you're on this extreme roller coaster of emotions that is limerence or even just a more extreme, passionate love. Let's now go into the causes. Why does it happen? There is no one unified theory for this. I have heard so many. I've also come up with some of my own. So I'm going to just laundry list a bunch here, and they will help segue very well into the solutions. One is unmet emotional needs. This could be for validation, like we've been talking about in our self-worth series. If we're not getting that validation from the inside, we look for it from the outside. Again, that idealization of the other person. We've put them on a pedestal. So, wow, if this person chooses me, then that means I'm okay. Versus some person that's at the same level as us. That's not going to rescue us the same way we were hoping for. So a lot of this can be connected to low self-esteem, loneliness, and just not having deep connections elsewhere, secure attachments with other people. So we hope that this person can save us and give us that feeling of connection and belonging. And a lot of this can be connected to attachment insecurity, like we talked about, anxious attachment, but also avoidant attachment and anxious avoidant as well. The novelty, the fantasy of it, I think that sometimes more creative or imaginative types can be more susceptible to this. And then often people that are more prone to addiction or intermittent reinforcement, these neurochemical rewards, the anticipation of pursuit, all of this is connected as well, the chemical dependency side. And then something Heidi brought up is that often this can happen at certain phases in life, such as life transitions. Some of the times that I've been the most limerent have been after big breakups, big moves, and she brought this up as well. So noticing, is there a trend of certain times in your life where you're more likely to be limerent? And I think that that's also connected to that idea of when we're not able to have a real relationship, sometimes we might turn limerent for this sort of pseudo relationship, or at least that's something that I've noticed in my life. And also, it can be fun. It is part of culture. Another cause is that culture sweeps us up in this. You tell your friend about two people you're interested in. One, there's this very passionate, kind of high chemistry feeling. They'll probably get a little more excited about that compared to the more stable, slow burn, consistent person. I mean, not all friends, but I'm just saying that our society reinforces this. We think that that's how love should always start. Okay, so let's talk about solutions. I'll tell you one that I think doesn't work and then a bunch of things that I think can help. What doesn't generally work is just trying to, quote, not think about them. You probably heard about the white bear phenomenon that is talked about in psychology, where if someone says, try not to think about a white bear, yeah, you're probably thinking about a white bear right now. So with this, especially with something as core to us as humans, as love and attraction, just trying to not think about the person doesn't work. Let's talk about instead what does work. I think the number one thing that people will often say is to realize that it is not about this other person. It is about instead what this other person means to you. Often they are a mirror for you. The reason why it feels so intoxicating for this other person to have these feelings towards you is because we have built them up so high in our mind that if we can attain a romantic bond with this person, if we are wanted by them, then that means we are at that level, or at least not so low as we feel. Again, given that so much of this has to do with self-esteem and validation. Seeing that and knowing that can help some, because then we don't have these continued stories about this truly being about true love. Because if we don't have a real connection with this person, if we are not actually interacting with them often in reality in a connected way, it's not romantic. It's a story. It's a fantasy. And we need to remember that. You might notice that a lot within this series on improving our relationship with ourselves is actually a lot on improving our relationship with reality. And that's why another step is to connect more authentically with this person. Because often what we do is we think, what kind of a person would this person, my LO, we might not really think of them as our LO, but that's what they are. Who would they like? Who would they love? And maybe we start changing ourselves a little bit. Often it's very common for people to pour into their appearance when they are limerent. And that's pretty standard across the board. But maybe we think, oh, they're a little bit sarcastic and maybe they'd like that. And maybe you subtly start behaving that way around them, even though that's not really how you normally act. Maybe you're more open and warm and have a more silly sense of humor that's a bit different. And in this way, we're not behaving authentically. We're changing into who we think will be loved. And we'll never actually know if we can be loved for our true selves or attract the kind of secure connections where we're loved for who we truly are. So the most brave thing we can do is to try to, as much as possible, be our true and authentic selves and then see who we attract. Maybe it will not attract this person that we're into, but that's actually a good thing, even if it hurts a bit in the moment or is incredibly hard in the moment. And let's talk about how we might start to behave more authentically. There is an excellent example. I believe it was from the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, which we talked about a few episodes ago. But I read that book a bit ago now, so I'm not 100% sure. But essentially, the author was describing an example of how to behave more authentically. And they painted this vivid image of being in a movie theater and crying because you're so impacted by the movie that's unfolding. You go out into the lobby after and you run into an old friend. They ask you, oh, how did you feel about the movie? And maybe they can't tell because you'd already wiped away your tears. Maybe you don't really want to expose yourself and share that it completely moved you and you already are thinking about seeing it again. So instead, you hedge a little bit and say, it was okay. Yeah, it was all right. And in that moment, you've actually betrayed yourself a bit. You have not spoken your truth. You've downplayed your feelings and have not actually, in a way, behaved in integrity with who you really are. So behaving more authentically in that moment would say, yeah, I found it really meaningful. It really moved me. How did you feel about it? And I do think that this can be hard. I sometimes get embarrassed to share my music tastes, which I feel like are maybe not as cultivated as some other people that are more into music than me. But learning to just say, oh yeah, I really like that band, even if it might not be a band that other people think of as cool or impressive, which even as I say this out loud sounds kind of silly. What's an impressive band to like? I mean, it's subjective. I know in this series, I've talked a lot about behaving authentically. And I think that sometimes we can lack clear examples as to what that means. Other ways to reduce limerence, if you really think that this person is not a good fit for you, reducing exposure. Some people will talk about no contact in certain settings. It can be helpful and it can take time for this to go away. I mean, it's technically an addiction to a person. And so another thing to pay attention to here, another strategy is paying attention to if you're someone that's prone to addiction in general, you might consider going to Sex and Love Addiction Anonymous, SLAA, or other resources I can link below. You might consider asking, do I have excitement or dopamine in other areas of my life? Maybe pouring into an art project or taking up bowling or even just finding a fun romantasy book to read at night. Asking instead, is all of your excitement coming from love, relationships, dating, this pursuit? Or do you have sources of joy or excitement in other areas? And of course, you could come up with examples that are way more exciting than books or bowling. You could let me know in the comments what else you think of. But we don't want all of our joy or little bursts of positivity to be purely through these other people. And going off of that, asking, what else were you hoping to get from that connection that you can give yourself? Whether that is connection and belonging, such as with other people, forming close friendships, community, or asking, is there a certain trait that they have that you really admire and want to develop in yourself? And how can you develop that in yourself? I noticed that a lot of my crushes historically have been on people that had traits that I really admired. And it took me a while to realize, do you want to be with them or do you want to be like them? Those are different things. Maybe the answer is sometimes both, but we often sort of want to merge or be close to these people because we almost feel like we'll soak in their positive attributes. And I think sometimes when you are with someone, you do develop traits similar to them, but sometimes you're almost hoping that they balance you out. And you can get the benefits of being with them without having to develop those traits. So then we can ask, what traits can I develop so that I don't feel incomplete in and of myself? Another thing you can do is learning more about limerence. I'll link some resources down below, such as the original book by Dr. Dorothy Tenov, a website that has a ton of information there. I have not gone through much of this website, so I'm not vouching for the whole thing, but I know that there is a website dedicated to limerence that has a ton of articles that might be helpful. I will link Heidi Prieb's videos on limerence down below too. I believe there's another book that's highly recommended in the field that I'll link below. I actually, full disclosure, did not find a lot of Tenov's book helpful. At a certain point, because it was very revolutionary in the field, she was the first person advocating for this term as being different than love, how we understand it. I think a lot of it wasn't understood at the time. She was a pioneer in the field. So given that a lot wasn't understood, so much of the book, after about 50% of the way through, started to say, like, we don't know why it develops and this and that, because I think being a researcher, she didn't want to speculate. She was only saying things that we know. That's why I think other people, such as Heidi Prieb, actually take these things a step further and ask, okay, why is this developing? What can we do about it? And that's what we're also trying to be doing here as well. Another thing you can do that isn't necessarily connected to healing wounds, which, by the way, we should be working on healing traumas that could have led to this. Often we become desperate to connect with people that remind us of our caregivers growing up. That's why psychodynamic works so well. So either next episode or the one after that, we should be having an expert on to talk about trauma and relationship to the self. So we'll go deeper into that then. And healing our attachment styles and all of that. We should also aim to keep busy some, because we had talked about a lot of this is measured through what percentage of the time are you thinking about them that's unoccupied. So feel free to occupy some of your time. Do things, have interests, throw yourself into work some. This wouldn't be healthy if we did it on its own and weren't working on the deeper aspects, but it's also okay to have and build a life which not only will make your life feel more full, so you won't be trying to fill a void through other people, but also we are occupying our mind, which can be helpful. We can also understand many factors that might be connected to this, such as OCD or genetic predispositions to addiction or having a really vivid imagination and being really creative. Because I think that often those people can get more imaginative about a potential future with a person they're not even connected with and get lost in this fantasy more. So we had talked about learning more about limerence, and knowing the term can be helpful. And also knowing more about yourself and your predispositions can be helpful. All of this helps you have a little bit less blame and to understand this is a thing that happens to many people. To some people, it happens more intensely than others, but it helps you not blame yourself. So knowing about limerence and how it works can be helpful because you start to see these things at play. Knowing that it's not about the other person, it's about what's going on within ourselves generally, at least with limerence. Then knowing about your situation in life. Are you going through a big transition? Are there a lot of emotions coming up right now? Are you going through a big breakup and you're taking all of those emotions and putting them on another person? And often realizing that when we're in this state of, like we talked about, that ready to be limerent state where people are almost interchangeable. It sounds bad, but she did talk about it in the book. That also proves that it's not necessarily about this other person. It might take some time to really sit with what are the unmet needs within us that are creating this sense of lack that make us feel that we need this other person so much. I know it's become sort of a cliche at this point that when we feel whole and good in our life, then the other person we're seeking is a great addition to our life. They're not filling this void that we're running from. And I know that it can be really hard to take a step back and do that in the moment, but that's where awareness really helps. Even if you're in the early phase of dating someone and you don't necessarily want to pause the relationship and take a step back that way, it could even just be taking an afternoon to ask, what can I give myself? For instance, if this other person represents security and stability to you, how can you give yourself security and stability? If they recommend excitement, how can you give yourself excitement? If they recommend care and love, how can you give yourself that? If they represent assertiveness and confidence, how can you cultivate those things within yourself? If they represent you being good enough, then I recommend visiting other parts of this series or other resources and finding ways to work on self-esteem and bolster that up within ourselves as well. Notice when you are feeding the fantasy and go back to reality. You might even journal. What has happened in tangible reality? Because, for instance, like we had talked about with you make eye contact from across the room, they might have just looked at you. Write what you know, not what are you making this mean. One thing you can also do, this is recommended in a lot of places, is to reduce uncertainty by just asking them out, telling them how you feel. And if it's someone that it's impossible to be with, that's where the limiting exposure can help. But I think often as you're working on all of this, you will naturally start to limit exposure because as you're seeing reality clearly, as you're meeting your own needs, you will start to rely on this person that has become an addiction to you less and less. I'll also link a resource by this channel. I think it's called Reclaiming You, and I think a lot of it has to do with limerence. I've only seen a couple episodes by the woman that runs that channel, but I thought she came at it from a different angle, more of the addiction angle. And she talked a little bit about the mundanity of life and how we're often trying to escape that through other people. And I found that really powerful. I think that some people do feel like they just wish life was a bit more magical than it is. Maybe life feels black and white, but it feels like it's in color with this person. But I don't think that it always feels black and white without them. It's just that often we get hooked on relying on something like another person for these highs. And I think she had some interesting stuff on that. So I'll see if I can find that specific episode and link it, or maybe just her channel in general, because I don't know if I'll be able to find that one. I do just want to acknowledge from a very personal place that I have felt limerent. I think not everyone fully has. And if you haven't, in fact, in the book, Dr. Tinov does say that there's limerence and non-limerence. I think more people now maybe see it a bit more as on a spectrum versus non-limerence. But there are people that I know that don't really get intense crushes. This whole idea just feels a bit foreign to them. And both groups of people can have a bit of shame. The people that don't get very limerent will feel like, I don't understand these songs and the intensity that so many people feel in movies. And the people that get limerent can feel ashamed about how much they're thinking about this other person and how intensely they want them. And I don't want this episode to feel shaming at all when I say it's not even about that other person. It's about a mirror for how you feel about yourself. That's not to create any shame either. we should actually be giving ourselves so much love and compassion, because that's really what we need. And that's going to help, instead of saying you're doing this because you have low self-esteem in a critical way. Instead, we should see ourselves as someone in need of a bunch of care and being in tune with our feelings and taking a step back and asking, what do I need? So that can be from a place of love. Oh, and one other thing that my producer sent me in preparation for this episode was a bit of internet culture around how people use this word in places like TikTok. A lot of younger people have found the term limerence and have found it helpful. And there's actually some really good TikToks putting out some good information on how to work through this and realize what it is. But then a bunch of the comments that she sent me were a lot of people, especially young people, really devastated about their relationships ending, and some of which feeling as though this whole thing was a lie. It was just limerence. It was a fantasy, and sort of disowning or taking their whole relationship and throwing it away. It's important to note that not all pain in relationships is limerence. It is that really specific definition of that obsessive needing of another person, specifically based in fantasy. There's a chance that you had a real connection with someone based in reality, and it just ended, and you have a lot of pain right now because that's just part of being a human and going through relationships and natural changes in relationships. But like I say all the time, especially in these heavier episodes, work with other people, such as a therapist or group therapy, talk to loved ones. And in fact, like I say also in this whole series, if it would be helpful for you, send this to a friend and maybe consider working through this relationship with yourself series together. So this is part 5 out of about a 10-part series. We will keep going on this track. We will have part 6 next week coming in the edit, because I realized after shooting this that this is very informational on limerence, but it doesn't cut to the core of how it feels to have limerence, which is so intense and sometimes painful and euphoric. So I wanted to do a follow-up that continues to dive on this topic, continues to give some hopefully applicable practical insights, but also has a bit more vulnerability and truth as to what it really feels like to be in limerence. So tune in next week for that. And we'll keep going on this self-worth journey together. Thank you so much for being here. See you next Sunday morning. That's when I post.